Welcome back into Forward Progress here on the Hammer Betting Network, presented by Betfred Sportsbook. This is going to be an early Super Bowl preview today. I will be joined by Eric Eager of Sumer Sports to break down the early market, Kansas City, Philadelphia, some props, and just generally talk about the Super Bowl. In terms of Super Bowl content, tomorrow on the Circles Off YouTube channel, I'm dropping a Super Bowl betting strategy video as well. It's pretty long. We went into detail with that. Be sure to check that out. That's on the Circles Off YouTube channel coming in tomorrow around 4 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. If you're in YouTube here, I do see your comments in real time. You can ask questions over the course of the show, and we will get to them over the course of the show. If you're watching on Twitter, that's great as well. Just know that if you are commenting, I do not see them in real time. So hop on over to the Forward Progress YouTube channel if you want to get in on the conversation. Really quickly, looking at the early market here for the Super Bowl at Betfred Sportsbook. So we're sitting at Eagles money line minus 125, Chiefs plus 105. That's kind of been a little bit of Chiefs money over the course of the last day. Nothing too crazy, but we've seen the spread now settle in at 1.5 pretty much across the board. After there was a bunch of early money on the under at open across a lot of shops that opened earlier on, a little bit of buyback towards the over there as well. So we're sitting at Kansas City minus 1.5, the total of 50 in the game. So nothing crazy. I mean, we're seeing some super high limits at a lot of these sports books right now, talking six-figure limits where you can actually rebet. So any sort of movement at this point would be a substantial amount of money that's coming in on one side or the other. Let's break it down. Eric Eager of Sumer Sports now joins me here on Forward Progress. By the way, if you haven't checked out Sumer Sports, check it out. Follow him on Twitter at Sumer Sports. There was a great podcast that dropped this week as well, reviewing the conference championship games, but also talking about how to evaluate the wide receiver position from a scouting perspective, from an analytical perspective. That was a very, very good listen. I would highly encourage people to check it out. So support what Eric does. I think this is some of the best football analysis out there on a weekly basis. Eric, I'm not sure if you have your voice after being at Arrowhead this weekend. I mean, how was that experience overall for you?
Well, Rob, thanks for the kind words. I think this is the first day where my voice feels like normal. And, as somebody with a booming voice, when you you listen to the podcast on Monday, I squeaked a few times. I was a privilege there. But man, it was great because, you and I think of the game very analytically, right? And I'm thinking settle for field goals twice in the first two drives, don't capitalize on the interception return. Don't come out of the half with with anything like a first down, even fumble when you're up 7 at midfield. I'm thinking, do we have to explain away another Chiefs game where they outplay the Bengals and then lose? And that's like how it felt. It was like it was going to go down the stretch. And, I was, with all those receiver injuries and stuff, I thought if this game gets to overtime, I think they're cooked. And, they inexplicably ended up winning that game in regulation even. A few calls, of course, went their way, which is, I just think, variance at this point. It was a very exciting game. And I think it just preludes the Super Bowl, which I think will be a game of evenly matched teams that do it a little bit differently than one another.
Yeah, I was watching, this was after the fact, but Monday, I went back to tune into the replay of the Hammer HQ watch along that happened. And the fourth quarter of that game was Kanish and Hitman on with Alex Moretto, 3 guys cheering for the Chiefs. And it was basically like they were going to a funeral there in the final 5 minutes of the game. It was very, very pessimistic outlook. And it did really feel like one of those games. Like we also failed to mention the 4th and 6 punt from the Bengals 37 or 38. Just like a lot of, like Andy Reid, great coach, but Andy Reid doing Andy Reid things,
Well, when you said 4th and 6 punt, I thought of the one that Burrow threw into double coverage that got caught by Jamar Chase. Mm-hmm. Again, the results matter this time of year, of course. But with respect to what we're doing here, it matters to like sort of grade it out and see how the players played. I mean, the Chiefs only gave up 2 touchdowns to that great Bengals offense with 3 rookie defensive backs playing the whole time. And both of those touchdowns were, basically aided by third or fourth and long 50-50 jump balls. And so, I think that I was somewhat facetious, but I thought the Chiefs would win big on Sunday. And I felt like, at least fundamentally, I was proven right, even though the game ended up being close. It is interesting now, though, you take that game and how well the Chiefs played and how much better I felt like they've become than the rest of the AFC. You have injuries. You have, they're playing a really good team that is just different than most of the teams they face in the AFC. How much of that do you think translates from one week to the next?
Yeah, for sure. And I want to break down, obviously, the Super Bowl here. Let's get into it. Full disclosure to the audience, if you haven't picked up on it already, Eric is a Kansas City Chiefs fan. He is pretty good, though, at remaining unbiased in these breakdowns. So we'll talk about it. But definitely, we saw a lot of the Vegas shops, some of the offshore books that open this game, open the Chiefs as anywhere between 1.5 to 2.5 point favorites. Immediately, money comes in on Philadelphia to the point now where we're sitting in market as the Eagles favored. It would have been a surprise a long time ago, let's say even a month ago, for the Eagles to be favored in this game on a neutral. We've come a long way since Jalen Hurts being out and Gardner Minshew backing him up, and 2 Eagles blowouts, and some concerns now with the Chiefs. Let's maybe start there. You look at the wide receiving crew and the injury designations heading into the Super Bowl. You have Juju Smith-Schuster banged up, Kadarius Toney banged up, McCole Hardman banged up, even Justin Watson banged up. You have Willie Gay banged up on defense, L'Jarius Sneed as well. How much do you think that the early money on Philly was just there's a lot of positive upside with betting the Eagles at this point?
I think it's entirely that. I mean, we saw the same thing happen similarly last week when we saw a lot of Bengals money, and ultimately that got cut off at 2.5 when a few groups bet Kansas City and brought it all the way back, to close at 1.5 for the Chiefs. I think that most of these injuries that are going to affect what the Chiefs want to do are minor. I think that L'Jarius Sneed's their second best defensive player. Concussion is either going to be like a 1-week thing and he plays, or a month-long thing a la Tua and he doesn't play. We'll find that out, I think, fairly quickly. But then on the other side, Smith-Schuster's dealt with this knee injury before. It's been a 1-ish week kind of thing for him. It's not an ACL. It's not an MCL. It's kind of one of those flare-ups that he has. I'm optimistic that he'll play. But Toney and Hardman, I think, I would be surprised if they were to play. Watson had an illness that kept him out of that game. And that was really opened the door for Valdez-Scantling to have his game, because Valdez-Scantling was the deep threat that they would basically play about 2/3 of the time. They played Watson 1/3 of the time. Valdez-Scantling basically played the whole game and took even some of Smith-Schuster stuff. I think in a pinch that works for the Chiefs, and MBS did a really good job. But I think you do need that rounded out receiving core to do a good job against this Eagles team, with the secondary that has, fairly good players in James Bradbury, Darius Slay, Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, and so forth. So it is, and I think that, basically, and anywhere from +2 to -2 is what, at most a 10% swing. So right. You're not really doing a ton here by laying Eagles right away or taking Eagles right away. And so I do think you're right. I think it's just an upside play in the event that all of these players in weak link systems like secondary, linebacker, wide receiver end up being out for the Chiefs. It does smell a little bit like the Super Bowl 55, where they look good on, it looks okay on paper for them, but ultimately when you get into that game, you're immediately like, oh, this is not going to happen here because of the injuries.
Yes, so I'm going to say what no traditional member of the media would probably say over the course of the next 2 weeks, but I will be absolutely floored if L'Jarius Sneed does not clear concussion protocol or does not play in this game. This is the Super Bowl. I get it. There's more of an emphasis on head trauma now. I'm not suggesting that he should play regardless. That's not what I'm saying, but it's the biggest game of his life. I think that there's a very high likelihood that he's going to find a way to play in this game. As scary as that sounds, if there are still symptoms or whatever. That's just That's just my 2 cents on the situation. So I would not rule him out. It's the wide receiver. The Chiefs already don't have a great group of wide receivers, right? I mean, you compare it to the rest of the league. Obviously, the addition of Kadarius Toney was big for them, but if he can't go, if he's limited in any fashion, I think that's where there's a real drop off.
So I'll push back a little bit on that, though. Like, I think they have a better receiving core than they've had for 3 years now, though, right? Like, if you look at yards per target, they had in the regular season, they had 1 yard more per target to the wide receiver position than last year. And that was not compensated for by a decline in Kelsey. Or the running backs this year versus last year have basically the same catches, yards, and then they have 7 more touchdowns this year, which is a little bit of variance. Kelsey actually had a better year this year than last. And even despite all that, the Chiefs receiving core 1 more yard per target than they did last year, even with Tyreek Hill in the fold. It's just that they don't have that top end player that they've had before. So when they play elite defenses, there isn't that one guy that can go out there and get them a bucket. I think the Valdez-Scantling game against the Bengals is more of an aberration than something that they'll be able to count on next Sunday. So it's a weird thing where I agree with you that on the top end, and maybe in a game like this, it's not as impressive as maybe it had been in the past. And, you can't run WASP for MVS.
Right.
But I think if the whole group is healthy, they're pretty solid.
I'm not suggesting that they're not solid. Like, I think the yards per target thing is a little bit skewed by the fact that the Chiefs, for about the first third of last season, went through like this transformation process on offense where they were just caught off guard by the defenses that they were playing up against. And they were trying to run the same offense that they were, a few years prior, and teams just weren't giving them the downfield shot or anything like that. So I think ultimately, I mean, I'm not suggesting it's a bad receiving core by any stretch of the imagination. Like, there's far, far worse out there. But I would say that it's probably average. And if you're missing players, that's significant. For me, I'm looking at the talking points surrounding this game, and the Eagles might be one of the most challenging teams to figure out in recent memory, of like any season that I can remember for a long time, because they have, again, it's the same talking point as last week, but they've played nobody, right? It's like their toughest games were the first 2 games of the year against Detroit and Minnesota. Detroit didn't even make the playoffs. Minnesota was a big fraud. They finally play a quality team last week in San Fran, and starting quarterback gets injured early on in that game, completely changes the dynamic of the game. And I feel like there's people that are on very opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to the Eagles, which is they're a fraud. They haven't played anybody. Give me Mahomes against the team that hasn't played anyone. I'm on the other side of it, where I think that they are just victims of having had an easy schedule, but their personnel is so good on both sides. Like, if you're game planning to beat the Eagles, there's not very many weaknesses there. They have a very good offensive line. They have 2 dynamic receivers on the outside. One of the most underrated tight ends, in my opinion, in Dallas Goedert.
Top 5 guy.
Defensive line that can basically like rotate 7 or 8 guys in. Hassan Reddick, great pass rusher, great corners. Like, I think the Eagles are a super complete team, and people just discredit it because of the schedule.
Well, not only that, I mean, you're right. It's weird because it's not like this is some 11-6 team that had an easy schedule. They're 14-1 when their 14-1 when their quarterback played, right? So like it's weird because what do you really expect them to do? I think that the hard one here is, and we talked about this last week, I think, the biggest thing I said about the game was whoever got out ahead was going to win that game by margin because of the running game and like how, both teams snowball on other teams.
Yep.
And the Eagles, we've seen that in both playoff games where they got out ahead and, it just got out of the other team's hands because they could run the football so well. That's the only thing. I don't think that the Eagles schedule is what I'm worried about the most. What I'm worried about is the lack of evidence we have that they can play in every single game script. We saw, they didn't trail in a game until week 10 in the second half. And in that game, you and I were on the Monday show where we come out in the second half against Washington, and it's just like Hurts like really struggled throwing the football when other teams knew he had to throw it. Even against Indianapolis, a team that won their first Jeff Saturday game and then lost that Eagles one, and then lost the rest of them. The Eagles had to win that game on a last go-ahead touchdown where Hurts didn't complete a ball on the entire series. And so to me, I think, and you saw it a little bit of it on Sunday, if Hurts drops back and you play disciplined defense and give him a little bit of pressure, I think that that's really how Kansas City can win. And, that's to me the only issue is like we do not have a ton of evidence that when the chips are down, Jalen Hurts can throw the football when they know he has to throw the football. And so, can the Chiefs stop the run enough? Can they get out ahead on offense enough to make that situations one that the Eagles have to play in? Neither NFC team has had to or got to. So we don't. So that's like the whole thing. I think that it's probably a coin flip as to whether or not the Chiefs can get Hurts into that situation. And then I'm very, very skeptical if they do that Hurts can get him out of it.
Yeah. So I echo a lot of what you said there because I watched Eagles San Fran last week and it very much felt like the Jalen Hurts of last year rather than the one we saw this year. The one where I was like, oh, I don't know if Jalen Hurts is the guy going forwards. Like he can do some nice things. He can scramble, break the pocket, but does he have the passing attack? And I think that's what a little bit of pressure does. And for the most part, the Eagles O-line, which is fantastic across the board, has been able to keep him clean. And again, this is not to discredit Jalen Hurts, but he's definitely a beneficiary of having that O-line. And we saw when a team is able to break that down, even on some plays, the offense isn't as free-flowing as we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, this game is a really it's A and Z of how to build a team or what you have to like. Patrick Mahomes, what's so special about this Chiefs Super Bowl appearance is they don't have the benefit of the rookie deal quarterback, right? Like, every single Super Bowl since 2012, with the exception of one, has included a quarterback or a team, that was built around a quarterback making rookie money. There was the Wentz Super Bowl where, he didn't make it, but and the Eagles have supercharged that approach. They got Hurts on not only rookie money, but second round rookie money. So then they trade a draft pick for AJ Brown, give him the max deal. Obviously they have Smith. The defense, they got Bradbury when, a lot of other teams couldn't afford him at that time. And, they trade for Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. They're in the middle of the season, they pick up Ndamukong Suh and Linval Joseph. Like they just are piling stuff around Hurts. And that's awesome. And that's a way I think most teams that don't have a Mahomes should try to win. It's just then the hardest question in football is then when some of those things break down, can you trust that quarterback to make plays? And I think that that's an unknown. I don't think Hurts has passed that test yet, regardless of how well he's played and admittingly how fun that team's been to watch this year.
They brought in a Robert Quinn as well, who just turns into like a rotational player.
Yeah.
And like Derek Barnett's on IR too. Like the depth that they had at that position is absurd. This is a good question from Brad, and it brings me to another talking point. But can this Chiefs defense mimic what the San Fran defense is, though? They don't have the horses across the defense like San Fran does. I really think Hurts wasn't fully prepared for the San Fran speed. So another comparison that's being drawn is to the Super Bowl a few years ago, Kansas City, Tampa Bay, where Kansas City had like the elite quarterback. Obviously, it was still Mahomes Brady. It's not like Brady was a scrub at that time or anything like that. But where we watched the domination in that game was at the line of scrimmage on both sides of the ball, where the Tampa O-line kept Brady clean for the most part. The D-line for Tampa in that game just destroyed Kansas City. Now, that's a couple years ago. Personnel changes. Things, I don't think Kansas City is, like, they're far removed from that, in my opinion. I think they're better on both sides of the ball at the line of scrimmage. But it definitely is a concern for me when I break down this game.
Yep.
Because I still think that the Eagles have a big advantage in the interior here. And this is, to me, I haven't bet the game, full disclosure to everyone out there, but this is, to me, what gives the Eagles the edge here and why I'd be willing to, I hate betting against Mahomes in a game where Mahomes basically just has to win, right?
Yeah.
In my opinion, the greatest quarterback I've ever seen play. Not the GOAT in terms of career achievements or whatever. Patrick Mahomes now is the greatest quarterback I've ever seen in my life. So the thought of just betting against him to win is, I don't want to do it. But I do think that the Eagles have some big stylistic mismatches in this game where I could see a replica of a couple years ago. Like, people just think that this game is blowout proof, right? Like, two great teams. I don't think so. Like, I could see scenarios where the Eagles win by margin and make the Chiefs look really bad.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, the Chiefs offensive line that played in the Bucs Super Bowl is maybe the worst offensive line ever assembled in an NFL playoff game. Like that, you're looking at like was it Mike Remmers playing left tackle? Andrew Wiley's actually a holdover. He plays right tackle still. Then you have Nick Allegretti, I think Austin Ryder, and I'm trying to remember like Steven Wisniewski. Like that was the R in war basically all around that offensive line. Now, Orlando Brown is not a great left tackle. Like Orlando Brown could be had. And when you think about Josh Sweat, you think about Hassan Reddick, who I didn't even mention in that, rant earlier. Like that guy's the first guy in NFL history to have 10 or more sacks 3 straight years with 3 different teams. Like he's a baller but I do think interior, you're talking about Creed Humphrey, maybe the best center in the NFL. Left tackle Joe Thuney makes and earns $16 million a year. Trey Smith was a little banged up on Sunday, but he's a pretty good right guard. And what the Chiefs did, so one game that might be instructive, and again, I'm not betting the Chiefs in this game. I actually think the number's fine. And I think there's, like you said, too much variance to really have a strong feeling on either side. But when you look at a game that might be instructive here is when they played San Francisco early in the season, what the Chiefs did with their running backs and tight ends was flare them out and chip on both tackles every single play. And they even had a touchdown called back because one time McKinnon was too far outside the tackle box and when he chopped the guy down and they called a penalty. But for the most part, they were able to neutralize Bosa and company by doing that. Eagles are even better than the Niners are up front. So that might not be worthwhile. But in that game, they got 100-yard games out of Valdez-Scantling and Smith-Schuster. Like that's the formula for beating up this defense. But it's thin, right? Like they have to make sure everything goes right. They have to make sure Mahomes has the mobility that he's accustomed to, which is not nowhere close to a lock. In fact, I probably think it's an underdog. And so that's the way they can do it. So I think they can do it with their personnel. But to your point, they are an underdog personnel-wise, offensive line against defensive line. And I think even though the Chiefs' defensive line was amazing Sunday, they're underdogs on the other side of the ball against what is a very good Eagles offensive line and what is a very good Eagles offensive scheme with Stoutland and Steichen both working in tandem to make sure that they get all the angles and stuff like that, both in the run and the passing game.
We're going to have a lot more coverage here of the Super Bowl on the Forward Progress channel on the Hammer Betting Network. If you do like the content that we're putting out there, make sure that you smash that like button and definitely subscribe to the channel. Pizza buffets coming your way Sunday morning, 11 a.m. I'm going to give my thoughts on the game overall, but also some player props that I'm looking to attack in the game as well. Next week, Wednesday, 12 p.m. Eastern time, we're doing a live props special. You'll want to tune in for that. That thing's going to go like 3.5 or 4 hours. Just people rotating in and out, giving their best Super Bowl prop bet. So make sure that you're subscribed to Forward Progress here on the Hammer Betting Network. Eric, I do want to talk to you about like some Super Bowl betting strategy just in general. And there's the Super Bowl, in my opinion, is a very different game than what we see from like a week 9 game in the regular season, right? You got the 2 weeks to prepare for both teams. You have the media spectacle prior. You have the nerves of this being everyone's like the biggest game of their career for the most part. You have the 40-minute long halftime show or whatever, right? And there's a lot of these short, there's small sample trends, right? Whether it's the low-scoring first quarters or the high-scoring third quarters, or teams breaking out trick plays at a much higher rate. And I think there's a divide on whether or not this stuff is useful or not. I'm in the camp of that it is somewhat predictive of what we're going to see going forwards because of the fact that this is a different game. It's not just a regular game. I'm curious your take on that, if you put any stock into like trends we've seen in previous Super Bowls, whether you think that matters in breaking down this upcoming Super Bowl.
I think if you can tie a reason to it, like I think the hard part about math and statistics is like a lot of statistics is black box and a lot of it is like, data in, predictions out, and you miss the mechanisms associated with it. So let's take, for example, the kickoff, right? So opening kickoff, the price for a touchback is anywhere. I have to think about historically, but like minus 130 to minus 200 as to whether that opening kickoff is going to be a touchback. And if you just look at regular season games played in stadiums like Glendale, like it should be more than minus 200 for the opening kickoff to be a touchback if both teams prefer kicking touchbacks, right? There are some teams that like to kick it short and cover, but like you can handicap it pretty well. And the price is almost always shy of what you would imagine it. And like if you were just going on season-long numbers, you would say bet the touchback every year. But what's the mechanism? Well, the mechanism is that the new football is hard as a rock and shiny and all that stuff. And so that's the reason why. So I think that if you can tie a mechanism to why the price would be independent of the base rates that are associated with regular season and Super Bowl, then then I think that it has all the validity in the world. And so when you say like why are third quarters a more higher scoring? Well, they 40-minute halftimes and they don't get to watch Shakira, right? They have to focus during those 40 minutes. And so like I think that if you can tie a mechanism and a reason to it, that doesn't necessarily mean you could be overfitting in your mind, right? And it could be narrative driven, but like the situation, like, oh, if the football is hard as a rock and the kicker can't break it in, well, then of course he's going to kick it shorter. That makes all the sense in the world. And then it's about kind of using more of an art than a science to create the price. So I think that many of them, especially when they crop up over and over and over again, and there's a mechanism that you can tie to why that happens, then I think it's valid.
I'll go even further. Like if I'm Isaiah Pacheco or Sky Moore or Boston Scott, and I catch the ball 2 yards into my end zone in week 7, and the coach has been telling me all week, like, we're going to take a knee. If it's okay, I'm going to take a knee. In the Super Bowl, you better bet I'm going to like try to bring this one home for a kick return touchdown. Like I just think that there are mechanisms in the game like that don't exist in just a regular game. And I think it's discounted too much by like the math. And listen, I'm a huge proponent of math. Like anyone who's seen my stuff, I just think that there's like another way to think about things sometimes and say exactly what you said. Like, can I apply logic to this situation that might, dispel the existing math or the existing data? And I think with the Super Bowl, we get a lot of those situations.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that the 2 passers per game thing, like the teams are always going to be trying to find an edge there, especially when it's interesting when you have 2 teams, and again, this is another mechanism when you have, and this is for further data. I actually haven't done this analysis, but if you have 2 teams that play in the same division, do you have more or fewer trick plays? Because 2 teams that play in the Super Bowl are, generally speaking, it's not usually a rematch that season. Sometimes it is, but most of the time, even if it's a rematch, there's not 2 teams that are familiar with one another. And so do trick plays happen more or less when you have less familiarity? How can you apply that? Do teams go for 4th downs more or less when they are not, like if it's Bengals Ravens and the Bengals have seen every one of these stupid ass Ravens 4th down rollout, no one wide open plays, I don't actually blame John Harbaugh for kicking as much. But if John Harbaugh's playing the Packers and they haven't seen him in 4 years, then what are you doing? Like, are you really going to, feel like they know they have your number there? So there's all these, like, I think it's also, and, Rufus says this, I think, and he's very well spoken in this, is like, try to find that variable in your numbers and control for it. And, there are some instances like the Super Bowl halftime show where maybe that data isn't in the database and you just have to make an inference based upon logic. But sometimes that is like, look, maybe it's familiarity is the lurking variable. Maybe it's something else that is the reason why these things happen differently.
I don't like to give credit to Rufus, as I try not to do that here on Forward Progress. But yes, he does say that, which is, it's very valid. You can learn a lot from what he has to say. Sticking with the math side of things for a second here, another big topic of conversation in the betting community this week. If you like the Kansas City Chiefs on the money line, why not just bet Patrick Mahomes as the MVP? If you like the Eagles on the money line, why not just bet Jalen Hurts as the MVP? The likelihood that a quarterback is going to win the MVP is super high. I'm curious your thoughts on that, because I made this argument 2 Super Bowls ago, which was the Mahomes-Brady Super Bowl. And I was like, there's no chance in hell. I never want to, like, let's never say 0%, but what it would take for one of these guys not to win the MVP in that game, the total was 56.5, if people recall. So we're going to get like the likelihood of a high scoring game is going to be there. What are the chances that one of these guys is not going to win it? Now this trend has kind of continued on year after year, where people, instead of taking the plus 105 with the Chiefs to win on the money line, they find a better price on Mahomes. Instead of laying minus 125 with Jalen Hurts, you can get plus 110 on the money line at Betfred Sportsbook. So curious your thoughts on that, in terms of whether or not that math makes sense. And like logically, again, there's like, this is a human element in this, right? Because this is a voted upon award.
Yeah, it's really funny. Last year, the Monday of the Super Bowl, I know we've had shows with Drew, myself and Drew Dinsick, and one of the sportsbook operators. We were all out for drinks, and we were actually like writing on a napkin like what the process was for pricing out Stafford MVP and then Burrow MVP, because I think this is one where you really do have to look at and actually price it out, where it's just like, for Stafford last year, it was, if he throws interceptions, is he going to get the Super Bowl MVP? And the answer is probably no, because we went into the game, he was the league leader in interceptions. Yep. And so that was going to be tied in. And we had priced into our brains this idea that he was not the chief guy winning these games. And so obviously Cooper Kupp wins the MVP, and there was a space there for people who thought this way to lose, right? And it is like it's not a true Polish middle, but it is like a situation where you can get screwed if you try to bet both sides and you leave a little bit of a middle there. But we also see situations like Patrick Mahomes' Super Bowl, where he did throw 2 interceptions. Damian Williams, the running back for the Chiefs, ran for 125 yards and scored 2 touchdowns, including the game-winning touchdown and the game-sealing touchdown. He doesn't even win. And so, like, I think you'd be very reasonable to look at the Chiefs and say, other than Mahomes and maybe Chris Jones, there is not a guy that can win MVP for that team in the event that they win. And then you look at the Eagles, and that's where it gets hard, right? I think with the Eagles one, it's very tough to make the argument that betting Hurts to win MVP is super correlated. It is correlated, of course, very correlated. But the daylight between Hurts MVP and Eagles win is pretty big. And specifying who that guy is, and this was the issue with the Tampa Bay Super Bowl. Tampa Bay's defense was amazing, but they didn't have one guy, right? The way that the Rams had Donald. And you look at Hassan Reddick being kind of the toast of the town now, and Darius Slay being a big name. The Tampa Bay Super Bowl, the defense won Tampa Bay that game, and the running game was really good in that game. But all of the parts for Tampa Bay, there wasn't a star, right? There wasn't a guy you could point to and say the defense played well. A la the 2000 Super Bowl where Ray Lewis won the MVP, despite like the fact that Chris McAllister had an interception for a touchdown and all this. Yep. Like that I think you have to think through and put probabilities to. And, once you do that, come up with a price for each player. And if there's daylight there, bet it. If not, and I'm guessing in this game for the Hurts side, there's not, don't bet it, if there's not daylight.
So Brad says, I think there's a much higher chance another Eagle wins it over another Chief. I agree with that.
Yeah, much higher.
So the Chiefs 49ers Super Bowl is a prime example, right? Like, but this is also like a narrative-based award. I don't think it's just strictly Super Bowl either that you have to factor in here. Like if you're voting on this award, and even Mahomes, let's say, hobbles around a couple times in the game on his gimpy ankle, and they end up winning the game, like who's not going to vote for Patrick Mahomes hobbled? Like it's going to happen, right? There are scenarios. Like in my opinion, Travis Kelce's been targeted like 1 million times in the postseason the last 2 years, right? I think 2 weeks ago he got 17 targets. There are scenarios here where he gets like half the targets for the team, 100 yards, and a couple touchdowns, and Kelce's very well likable player. Like that can totally happen, right? But I think that in the Chiefs' case, it actually does make a lot of sense to bet the Mahomes number. I think the likelihood of Mahomes winning the MVP if the Chiefs win the game is probably in the 95% range. Like
that was what I was going to put. I mean, you have to chase. You're right. The narrative is so interesting. I think if Mahomes wasn't injured and Kelce had this back injury that clearly hampered him last week, and you could you could sort of work around this. Oh, Kelsey's playing banged up and he has 17 catches for whatever and ends up with the MVP. Then maybe there's that. I also think Chris Jones having such an amazing game last week that he's going to be on everybody, having his first sack in the postseason, all that. People are going to be thinking about him a little bit. But beyond that, I can't see Isaiah Pacheco winning MVP. I can't see Valdez Scantling, who had a great game the other day. Like, I can't, but it's interesting. We did see, even in the Brady Super Bowl, I saw Deion Branch win an MVP. We saw Edelman win an MVP. So it's possible for sure, even with a guy who's considered goated by the media, for another guy underneath to win an MVP. I think for the Chiefs it makes some sense. But again, I would just tell everybody, price it out and make the price yourself and see what ends up happening, because that is a really instructive exercise. Basically saying, like, to not bet this or to bet this, I need this. I need Mahomes. You said 95%. What if it's 97.5%? Then you're like, okay, well, that's too much daylight for me to feel all of that. That's too much. That's a lack of daylight that I don't think exists. And therefore, I'm not going to make that bet.
Yeah, like previously in time, I would go through the regular season. I did this with Matt Stafford, Cooper Kupp last year, right? I bet Cooper Kupp to win the MVP, and I'm going through the regular season games and basically like how often would Stafford have won in these games versus Kupp, because Kupp had some games where he got like 2/3 of the team's yardage in the passing game, right? And there was like way more of a case to be made for Cooper Kupp. I think that's the case with the Eagles as well, right? I think you could have a huge Devontae Smith game. You could have a huge A.J. Brown game. You could have a Dallas Goedert multiple touchdown game as well. And maybe Jalen... Yeah, and like Jalen Hurts has 10 rushing yards because the Chiefs just try to keep him in the pocket or something like that. And it doesn't look as flashy anymore for Hurts. And he's struggling a little more like he did against the 49ers. So, I don't love that approach. If you like the Eagles, I'd rather just bet the Eagles money line to win the game than Hurts MVP. Chiefs, I'll stand by my 95%. And if Mahomes doesn't win it, then it is what it is. But there's just not many scenarios, in my opinion, where he doesn't get it. Like, especially knowing that we already saw a Super Bowl where he did not deserve to get it and ended up getting it as well. Let's spend just a couple minutes here. Just early quick thoughts. I'm not going to hold you to this. We won't go break down the entire player prop market. But if you had to pick one player in the game that you think could outperform their expectations going in, and one player that you think will underperform versus their expectations, who would be those guys?
Yeah, I think the best bet on the board, and this I take a lot of inspiration from you about this, is Jody Fortson 60-1 to score the first touchdown of the game on BetMGM. I know we're sponsored by Betfred. I want to make the point that BetMGM hangs some of the worst numbers in the market, and so I'm more throwing Betfred the flowers as opposed to pointing out another sports book. But Fortson was on the field for I'd have to look at but for my estimation, like 15 snaps or so. Yep. If they don't have Smith-Schuster, if they don't have Sky Moore, if they don't have some of the other guys, Hardman's a big red zone guy for that team, right? So if he's not there, then there could be a problem. I think that Fortson is a guy that Mahomes likes to look to on fades and slants, and he's on the field in the red zone. Especially if they're down at wide receiver, they're going to play a lot of 3 tight ends, and he was up on Sunday instead of Blake Bell, who was healthy. So I think that he's the guy when I think shooting over expectation. You're also getting a better price because he didn't get a target last week, even though he was on the field a lot. That's my one that I like a lot. This is one where the market has actually moved against me, but I actually like Jalen Hurts under passing yards as well. Like I think that there's a number of outs here. If the Eagles win, like we've seen it already, Eagles win in the playoffs is an under and an under Hurts passing yards look. And then back to my original point, like if the Chiefs were to win and be in control of this game, I think that Hurts is going to struggle. And I think also we've seen them want to run the football even when behind. So I just don't see, and I think a lot of people are gravitating to the week 4 or 5 game last year where they played each other and Hurts put up a ton of yards. Yep. And they're like, oh, that's evidence. This Chiefs defense is better and more explosive and faster than they were last year. But also, I think the Eagles are much more committed. Like, I think the Eagles say we got here by running Hurts, by running our backs. by being very conservative on offense in a good way, I think, not like the bad way. And that's kind of their identity. I don't think they want to drop Hurts back that much, even unless it's completely necessary. And the situations where it's completely necessary, as we talked about, are far fewer than 50% of the game.
Yep, fair enough. I know you mentioned like briefly Sky Moore, but he's one guy that as the injury situation plays out for the Chiefs over the course of this week, I could see Sky Moore filling like a Kadarius Toney role where it's kind of a coming out party for him, where they utilize him effectively in the screen game as a wide receiver. I don't know yet. We're still ways away from seeing how this is going to play out and who's available for Kansas City. But if we are missing guys, I mean, I've always been a fan of Sky Moore. They're utilizing him a lot on special teams right now because he's a dynamic player there. But I could see this being the type of game, couple weeks to prepare, where they try to incorporate him into the offense.
I think you're 100% on. One of the things I tweeted out yesterday was both of these head coaches are really good, but how Sirianni is really good, which is in-game decisions and stuff, I think that's good with 1 day of rest. The way Andy Reid's really good, not in the in-game decision-making or time management or whatever, he's really good in the scheme. And I think the bye helps him more than it helps Sirianni. So when you're looking at, edges there, Sky Moore has 2 outs to be productive in this game. He has the Kadarius Toney, McCole Hardman type of receiver where he might get catches that aren't really catches, right? The little pop pass things on the stuff that they like to do to Hardman and Toney. But he could also play the Juju role, which I think is actually his direct receiving line. When they're all healthy, he's Juju's backup. So I think that there's actually 2 ways in which he can be productive in this game. And I think that he's going to play regardless because I think that I put the probability of Juju and then either Toney or Hardman being healthy is almost zero. Like I think you're looking at an and probability that's very small. And so I think he either plays as Juju direct player or he plays as Hardman and Toney's direct player in the Chiefs offense. In either case, they'll probably scheme up plays for him.
Yep. I completely agree with that. Eric, appreciate you joining me. Let the viewers know what's going on for you during Super Bowl.
Yeah, so I'm at Eric Eager _ on Twitter. I will be at the Super Bowl Tuesday and Wednesday doing, various Radio Row stuff. I certainly look forward to that. And at Sumer Sports on Twitter, we're posting a lot of graphics and stuff like that associated with, anytime a new head coach is hired or, a player like Brady retires or something like that. We're trying to keep everybody up to date on that kind of stuff. So check us out there. Rob, this has been fun.
All right, Eric, take care. Enjoy Media Row next week. All right, that's Eric Eager of Sumer Sports. I would highly recommend checking out the podcast. Just follow Sumer Sports on Twitter, SUMER. They tweet out all the content, so on and so forth. But the stuff with Thomas Dimitroff, who used to be the Atlanta Falcons general manager, is really good. Really, really good stuff. So I can't recommend that enough. I'm personally back Sunday morning, 11 a.m. Eastern time here on Forward Progress. Again, if you enjoyed the Super Bowl breakdown here, the early preview, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and if you feel like it, tell some friends. Just let them know that this content is available to them. We'll be producing stuff well after the Super Bowl as well in the offseason, breaking down all sorts of offseason moves. So plenty more to come here on Forward Progress, which is the NFL division of the Hammer Betting Network. Thank you very much to Betfred Sportsbook for sponsoring our content. If you are in Arizona, Colorado, Ohio, Iowa, or Pennsylvania, actually Nevada now as well, where they are licensed, make sure you check out Betfred. Again, I practice what I preach. I bet at many different sports books, as many as I can. If I was in a state with Betfred, I would 100% be betting at Betfred. You can always find edges at different books. Great live in-game product as well. Make sure you check out Betfred Sportsbook. That's it for me. Thanks to everyone tuning in. This has been Forward Progress here on the Hammer Betting Network. Peace out.